Um, G'day. So we are back in our experimentative streaming world. Um, I've been working on putting together a lean portfolio management boot camp. Um, and this is a live session where I've got Eric to bounce the first round of thinking off. And what I can say is it is very much a first round of thinking. So before I set screen share, I'm going to give you some context. I have a standard pattern that I use pretty much every time I move on a portfolio. Um, and my notion when I went, hey, I can turn this into a boot camp was to go, all right, let's turn my standard pattern into something that I could teach and put the beginnings of together in a training room, and then support follow up. And, the first round of testing of the thinking was to say, hey, let's do a 4-day boot camp. Because if we could do a 4-day boot camp, we could come out with a pretty solid view of the portfolio at the end of 4 days. That'd give us a good springboard. And then that instantly hit challenge areas because putting the group of people together for 4 days was a huge ask. So we reframed it to be 2 days to kick us off, followed by basically about 3 months of weekly check-ins to tune as they start to move on it, with reservation for a couple of half-day workshops when we hit moments of truth. So the goal is to get, here's 2 days, which feels much more practical than theoretical, but it definitely sprinkles in some theory, and knowing that there'll then be a whole bunch of follow-on that they do on the back of it. As soon as I started trying to frame it, and I went straight into, I'm going to do pink sheets. So I'll synthesize what I've been doing to pink sheets. I use the pink sheets as the base for generating the training, which sent me into wrestling with models learned. And what I can tell you is I've got no pink sheets, but I have a whole bunch of thinking I want to test with you on the model. I'm going to screen share, and I'm going to prime. So I know we have a rule that says we are oriented towards and being positive rather than negative in the way we think about stuff. But I'm going to test the edges of that rule. So the safe LPM, when I started to go, hey, let me put together a model, I went, surely I should base the model off safe LPM. So I went through the 3 dimensions. I really struggle with the balancing and the interrelationship of the 3 dimensions as safe uses them. And I think part of the balance question for me plays out if you look at the LPM content, i.e., if you read the articles, you look at the LPM course. What you find when you look at the course and you read the articles is maybe 80% of the lean portfolio content is strategy and investment funding. And probably being generous, 20% is lean governance and agile portfolio operations. And that's, I don't know, is it 5% agile portfolio operations? It's a really kind of imbalanced model in terms of the weight of attention and content in safe, and the way people use it.
Well, I think there's a I struggle with the same, and I think there's a further little there by visually showing getting them same size. People do more play operation like it the PM place and do things that are to be doing management.
We have you in robot mode again. You have struggled with the same.
I've struggled with the same, and I think what I was trying to say a moment ago was I might want to drop the stream to just be one camera. I think that's probably easier. But what I've observed is because they're shown the same size, they're given equal conceptual weight by people in the PMO in the organization that likes to coordinate things.
Yeah.
When I think you and I have discussed on stream and off plenty of times that portfolio management really is setting direction, fueling things, and primarily getting out of the way,
Yep.
ensuring that your organization structure meets your strategy needs. But by giving it so much surface area visually, portfolio operations creates a place for way too much dependency management and things the arts could be doing themselves.
Yep. But
So,
like, having said which, there is a world that says maybe there's a role for portfolio operations very actively uplifting the arts in those areas. Um,
mhm.
but a lot of the things, and this is where it really messes with me in terms of the way the model works here, a lot of the things that I might see the portfolio do operationally in terms of supporting and evolving the arts actually turns up in strategy and investment funding and lean governance.
Hmm.
um,
So is it instead of three triangles, two pillars with a little bit of connective operational tissue?
yeah, and even there, it gets a little tricky. And I don't know that I've got a better answer yet, but I'm kind of sharing this to share what happened when I started to go down the model path. Because if you zone in
Yep.
on strategy and investment funding, you get connect the portfolio to enterprise strategy, maintain a portfolio vision, realize the vision through epics, establish budgets and guardrails, and establish portfolio flow. Um, we've chatted about this plenty of times. There's an awful lot of LPMs that begin without actually the ability to create their own strategy. They inherit a strategy and their job is to manage it. So it really puts you down into that world of need epics, need Lifecycle, need guardrails. Um, and that's kind of the strategy and investment funding part. If you go through agile portfolio operations, you get coordinate the value streams, where arguably you're filling some gaps if you don't have a large solution. And then you're supporting execution, already touched on. Come across to lean governance, you're looking after the money, you're looking after portfolio performance, you're looking after continuous compliance. But actually, a hell of a lot of that turns up back in portfolio flow. Because if I think about portfolio flow, I think about Epic Lifecycle. And particularly for most earlier portfolios, epics are the primary vehicle of value realization and forecasting and budgeting. So I don't know
So
if you
far makes
want to.
sense.
All right. So in hunting, I went, well, what's the path that I take, right? Now, leaving aside the really interesting question is to say, what is it about lean portfolio management that makes it lean? And I'm going to come back to that one. But my core process is to say, I want to frame your strategy, or if you can't frame it, at least visualize it. Shape your book of work in such a way that you can clearly relate it to your strategy. Visualize your life cycle, align your plans, steer execution, and ensure evolution. Um, and this is kind of the cycle we go through. We go, well, what are the decks you're showing your board or your exco to sell what you're doing in this space, right? Um, how do they relate to broader enterprise strategy? Let's get a clarity, because in most cases you've got those decks. Those decks don't have any direct mappable correlation to the work that's actually happening. Um, and you live in a place of duality that says you talk about what's in the strategy deck, or you talk about what's in the work, or you look for somebody to work some translation magic and try and relate the two things together. So I want to begin by going, well, let's actually start to try and maintain a living correlation, um, so we can start to shift our conversations. Then we always go next to shaping your book of work and go, well, you've got stuff you're doing. Some of it will be agile, some will be waterfall, some will be some kind of mix. Um, let's actually get a picture of that. Let's get that picture mapped back to your strategy. Um, and let's see what we can do in terms of some kind of consistent leveling and understanding of the way you frame your book. Um, think about your life cycle. As often as not, there's a piece of the life cycle you've got no control over because there'll be a gating process somewhere. Um, then there's some that you probably do have a bit of control over. You want to be able to see that. You need some kind of planning alignment, whether that's road mapping, planning conferences, you know, setting up the right arts and setting them free, something in terms of your rhythm and your cadence, um, and then an ability to steer and monitor as it flows. Um, and then you've got to have some kind of evolution cycle. So if you like that as the path, and I started out thinking that was the model, and then I went, I'm not quite sure how that works as a model. So I started playing, and I went, let's go back to really popular lean models. Um, and I wanted to trace back out of the land of all the derivatives. Um, and so we got fundamentally on the left, um, is the uh, is it John Shook? Um, I should have kept the URL in.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the early ones.
Yeah, one of the really early ones. Like what I was looking for was what's the least amount of translation from that first lift out of Toyota. um,
Okay.
and it was really in that world of trying to answer the question of what makes a lean portfolio lean. Um, and going, there has to be some way you can tie that back to lean principles, lean values, lean something. So there's the very early 2 pillar version before we had 3 or 4 pillars in safe that were borrowed from 3 or 4 pillars in somebody else. Um, then I went across to the machine that changed the world land, um, the Womack and Friends version, as opposed to the slightly reworded safe version,
Hmm.
and sidetracked again to the Lean Enterprise Institute's lean change model. Um, and I think I like both the House of Lean and the Cycle, as really good anchors for this notion of what makes lean portfolio lean. Um, but I'm really anchoring into, I think, the Womack and Jones cycle.
Uh, Let me know when you want me to start
I,
adding
I'm
ideas or reactions.
I'm going to pause for reactions here.
I like the getting back to the loop. Um, the pillar versions arguably are fully expressed in the safe principles at this point, and theoretically should be everywhere in the framework. In practice, I don't know that I see people bringing them in explicitly unless the practice tells you to.
Yep.
Um, but the loop, and we see this showing up in the flow materials as well now with the reinvigorated maximize time and flow and things like that, which
Yep.
drives into this. What is it? Product perfection game, I think it was called.
Yep.
Perfection game. Um, but I wonder, looking at this, is what you're highlighting now the solution or development value stream layer, and you need an outer loop akin to double loop learning that is maybe derived off the X matrix and go back to Hoshin as another
I,
original source.
I did think about heading back into strategy deployment and Hoshin Cannery. At which point life gets very complicated. Because I think Hoshin Cannery, like, it's a very specific set of techniques in terms of the strategy deployment stuff. Which raises the bar of sophistication quite a lot.
If we distill it down and we don't try to do the full mapping grid, which, don't get me wrong, I love me a good goal dependency mapping across value streams. It looks great and there's an easy mapping.
Yeah.
But if you just look at the progression of long-term goals inform, they say annual objectives. You could read this as short-term or mid-term objectives, maybe 2 to 4 PIs horizon. Inform what are the most important things across all portfolios that need to be done, which you could interpret as perhaps your ethics, if you wanted to just create an anchoring mechanism, and then loop that to metrics to improve, and then out to the right of the metrics to improve, you have the value streams or arts that are most focused on achieving them. And then that feeds the loop back to, and how do those change and inform your long-term goals? And that outer loop is already somewhat embedded in a lot of the OKR models.
Yep.
And the person slash value stream responsible. It's person in the original model because it pointed at the department heads, I believe. But the uh, if you said this value stream is responsible for advancing this top level priority in the primary or secondary correlations, and map that as a little reference grid against your epics. Now you've got a straight connection from company strategy, long term goals to annual or midterm objectives for the portfolio, which could be your strategic themes, to your epics, to your improvement metrics, and back to your long term goals. And that could be a nice outer loop around the perfection game that's at the value stream level.
Let me offer another perspective on that. And this is kind of the wrestle that I've had, right? Because there's the piece of me which goes, what I'm passionate about is the true portfolio, right? The one we'd love to see that frame strategy and funds value streams to pursue that strategy, as opposed to the portfolio most people have. And what I mean by the portfolio most people have is that most people, when they begin LPM, either only have some value vehicles or they have very few value vehicles and the portfolio is the only place they can see value.
So those two again, they
either have only some value vehicles, right? So let's take an easy example. They've got some work that is done by streamlined arts and some work that's done via waterfall projects, right?
Yes.
So let's call that scenario A. Scenario B is they have a portfolio dominated by complicated subsystem arts, and the only place that it can actually see value flow is at the portfolio.
Glad you elaborated because that's not what I took the first time through.
Yes. um, so that the argument for me is that the dominant portfolio scenario is that why they bring it to life is actually to solve for the fact that they can't manage value flow in their vehicles without putting a wrapper around them. And that,
And if I just to translate that out, I'm hearing you say because the arts or equivalents have no ability to deliver value on their own, they can only see value at the portfolio level.
yep.
Okay.
And I think there's an argument there that says part of your job in the portfolio as you seek perfection is to leverage the portfolio level insights to enable you to evolve the structure of the vehicles to such a fashion that you can start to see value flow at lower levels and be less dependent on the portfolio as a wrapping container, right? And sort of a data oriented choice.
And if I look at that to the triangles view, that is perhaps the 80% responsibility of agile portfolio operations is to help bring that world about.
Yeah. So I'm just going to grab this image because I think it kind of tells the story I'm trying to tell with a visual. This one. This for me is kind of the reality picture for most is on the right, right? They build trains around systems of record. They build trains around platforms. Um, and then the portfolios are put together atop the lot across the lot of it to wrangle it.
Yep. And you have the forever debate of whether those systems of records are a platform portfolio or if they get to live in line of business portfolios, who owns them, or can you have multiple developers working on them on multiple arts, blah, blah, blah.
The endless debate, right? And and
Hmm.
and my argument is the study of flow should give you the data to drive the simplification and evolution of that so that it doesn't
Yep.
become theoretical, it becomes data oriented.
So normally I'd expect somebody to reference team topologies right about here. Is there a reason you didn't?
Uh, if I got to get out of the habit of alt tabbing, so I
Or
can.
video just that um, particular tab?
Yeah, the trouble, and I've played with that idea of going, do I video ninja one tab? Um, and then what happens if I decide to change tabs? Maybe I need a video
At the
ninja
top,
for the top same screen.
well, at the top of every Chrome window, it gives you a button to click to ship that tab instead once
Okay.
you've shared.
Maybe that's the scenario. So this is the slide that comes straight after that. Um,
Yep.
and then the real hope that I have is that you start to head into this kind of land. Um, but I think the crux of a lot of this for me is, if you're trying to get this evolution, um, what's great in a train and a PI planning is you can go red string is a problem. And a sign that you're evolving is you got less red string every PI, and you've got less red string not because you've carved your work down to avoid red string, but because you've evolved your team topologies to avoid red string as you pursue value. But we don't really have an equivalent of the red string across train boundaries.
Mm.
I think Rebecca Davis shared a mural or a Miro once where she had a visualization of red string across a ridiculous number of trains, but most people don't have that. Um, and that's where I
Yeah,
think
because
there's a sorry, go on.
I want to poke at that for just a second because we have it explicitly in one place and implicitly at the next level out. And so explicitly, we have the train of trains board as part of solution planning,
Yeah.
which isn't full portfolio, but it is a mighty close roadmap you could choose to visualize if you wanted to do that kind of coordination across the full portfolio. I don't know that I'd recommend that. And then the implicit is uh, I don't know how easy it is to do in most tools, but even 7 or 8 years ago in Rally, we were able to generate a uh, epic touch board, basically, which trains had work for a given epic aggregated across all epics.
I,
And while that wasn't perfect from a topologies view, it got pretty dang close.
yeah, Jira Line had similar stuff. Um,
Hmm.
and that's, there are ways to visualize your red string. I think part of the challenge with the solution board in terms of the true visualization is because a lot of portfolios are actually full of suppliers. And so are actually realistically a lot of solution trains because you see the system of record turn
Hmm.
up as a supplier in 5 different portfolios or 5 different solution trains.
Yep.
Um, so it gets incredibly complex, and that's life. Big enterprise and agility is incredibly complex, but it's where I think part of the job of the portfolio is to create the you know strategic level visualizations that help you to understand the systems and I guess the human systems and the organizational systems that need to collaborate to pursue strategy, so you can start to apply
Hmm.
system thinking to them. Um, so part of my, and kind of looping back to where I began, part of my comfort with thinking through this loop rather than worrying about inner loops and outer loops is actually going, where do most people begin? Um, and where most people begin says, actually, this kind of, as often as not, is the job the portfolio is there for doing, depressing as that is. So I'm going to file Hoshin Cannery because, thank you, that's going to, I debated it today and I tried to stop myself from losing myself in complexity. Let me take you down to what happened when I tried running that loop. Um, and really, the first thing I did with that kind of the 5-step Womack and Friends loop was to go, if this is the set of steps that I generally follow, what happens when I overlay those steps on the loop?
Okay.
Right. At that point, I kind of went, frame your strategy and shape your book of work is identify value. Um, it's a strategic view of value, but it's really the identify value piece. Mapping the value stream becomes visualizing your life cycle. Creating flow becomes aligning your plans and steering execution. Um, Establishing pull doesn't really fit my steps, but I know what I do there. And this is about supply and demand leveling. And I'll have to come back to explain why. right? But demand smoothing um, is a huge part of this for me, and things you're trying to do. And then seeking perfection is about obviously relentless improvement at the portfolio level. Um, but it's also recognizing that you run foundationally an annual cadence. Um, so there are small changes you can make, and definitely lots of small improvements you can make during the year. Um, but there's an annual loop that sits over the top of your portfolio evolution. And fundamentally, what happens is once a year, you get a chance to make a big change, and then you get the rest of the year to exploit the change that you made. Unless and until you live in an organization that's completely done away with an annual planning cycle. Have you ever worked with any of them enterprises?
I'm sorry, say that again. Have
Have you worked with any
you worked with,
enterprises that have abolished an annual planning cycle?
uh, um, I've worked with ones who have gone multi-phase within an annual planning cycle.
Yeah,
So they still have the big cycle, um, but it gets lighter and lighter weight the more you into a tighter pivot.
right. Cool. So
Um,
we're in exactly the same view
at
on that then.
a
Yep.
yeah, so nobody at like Fortune 50 scale, but individual portfolios within the Fortune 50 and small companies, the uh, few hundred million run rate for sure.
Yep. And I spent ages just testing this. So this is where some of these I've started to build out and map out, and some I can only talk to what goes on there. But if you dig inside frame your strategy, I think there's a piece of this which is, recognize some realities. So there's a reality that says generally your portfolio is going to run an annual cycle that kind of looks something like this. There'll be a little bit of wriggle room over the timing and the sequencing and some of what goes on. But theoretically, you're going to have an annual cycle that says somewhere late in Q1, there'll be a number shared, right? And that number will be last year plus or minus 10%, general terms. This is the investment dollar allocation that's going to be available to the portfolio. So you can bet last year, if you got $300 million, this year you'll get $300 million plus or minus some percentage
Okay.
total for your portfolio. That number will come out, and what will then happen internally in your portfolio at what a level of the portfolio sits, there'll be a call for proposals, right? What do you want to do? This, and everyone everywhere in the portfolio will go, this is the thing I want, right? And at this point, we haven't put a business case up yet. As often as not, it is a spreadsheet, and people are putting lines in a spreadsheet that say, I've got 5 words describing what I want to do, and I've got a number I wave my finger in the air for. Um, and there'll be some kind of compilation process going that says, we got given our number, let's say our number was 300 mil, we got a long list of people, we're massaging that back together to come up with $300 million ask. If we're clever, we'll have a $350 million ask because we know they're going to take away eventually. We might as well start with a nice little cognitive anchoring. Generally, kind of late Q2, you need to put that first round of submissions back to your enterprise PMO, your something, whoever in the organization looks after the annual enterprise investment strategy. You'll spend Q3 balancing the books. By and large, there'll be some horse trading between the portfolios because everybody asked for extra, and they're all going to fight for their right to a bit of extra. And so that early indicative number will go up and down a little bit. But you're looking for by the end of Q3 to pretty much have a solid view on what the book's meant to look like. You spend Q4 processing the impacts of whatever the end result was back internally, and then notionally your budget's final at end of fin year, you're ready to start the new year. So every
So,
enterprise that I've played with, their
right.
cycle has kind of looked like this. It's been about a 3-quarter process.
So I will agree for messy enterprises without clean product streams. Um, what I've observed is the better your value streams are, the better your ability to treat individual arts or portfolios like their products
Yep.
and standalone, the less this game plays out
Yes.
and the easier it gets. Um, there's still some of it usually around enterprise epics and goals, but the conversation much more becomes who gets the rest of the discretionary budget instead of what are we going to drop and the dramatic reshuffling that comes from a dense dependency matrix.
Yep.
So I'd argue the orange is a legacy of project based as much as it is a reality of the theory.
And really the orange for me is again, it's the overlay in the legacy. Because I'm thinking if you've got somebody starting LPM, generally if you're starting LPM, you're living in this land, right? You're not in clean value
Mhm.
streams. That's a land you'd like to live in. This is a land you're probably in. And
But
some of
it,
the
but it does.
sorry, go on, but it does.
uh, I was going to say, but it does raise a question: is there a different LPM adoption pathway for more product oriented companies? And maybe that's a different topic later.
It's a good question.
That's maybe even a general criticism of how people tend to approach safe. Is it? I'm gonna quote a little bit of Ray Arel here, who led the transformation at Intel for a very long time, which is safe Scrum. Most of our practices are countermeasures. Make sure you have the problem it's solving before you apply the countermeasure.
Yes.
And I think our current LPM process is very much grows out of you have projects are killing you. Let's fix that.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to where I was. Assuming you are here,
Mhm.
um, the orange is a bit of a reality check again on the legacy. Because generally in the legacy, whatever the number is already better than half spent by the time you get it.
You
There's a
build a long range fan based on a false guess.
right. There is a truth that says the budget might have meant to have been final before the end of fin year, but usually there's a whole bunch of horse trading still going on and fine tuning. So often you spend a lot of Q1 ironing out the final gaps in the fin year's budget. By the time the new number comes out, often you're still trying to tune the last number, and working out what's in and out based on the last number. New number comes out, you look and you go, I've got multi-year projects that had planned carryover, and I've got mandatory compliance stuff, ALM, reg change, pick your poison. Half the book spent, whatever's left, serious contention.
And I think I'd actually put more argument on the second quarter's issues than the first. It's less that the budget's not finalized, more that you didn't actually know what was going to be finished in any reasonable time period.
Yeah, absolutely. Q3 is a horse trading game. Notionally, it's review and enterprise balancing. Reality, it's horse trading, where usually the supporting artifact is a spreadsheet. And when money goes up and down, usually the only thing that they're changing significantly is the burn rate. Right? How much of this project are we going to get done this year instead of next year? You don't tend to trade outcomes in and out. You tend to trade progress. If
Okay.
that's your starting cycle, the next kind of reality check is, as I mentioned before, usually there is some kind of declared strategy, and it's usually very pretty. It often has 4 pillars. And then you've got a book of work, and this is a picture of an actual book of work. This is the list of top level, and in safe speak, let's call them epics. This is the epics that comprised a $300 million-ish portfolio. The size of the pie on the pie graph is the dollar size of the epic.
And is that 53% a epic that contains all maintenance and upgrades and minor work?
No, that was a bit of cloud migration work.
Oh, okay. So that was a real one.
No, that was a real one, right? that the 53% was actually one of the 4 pillars. The other 47% was notionally the other 3 pillars if you did enough creative mapping. But there was nothing maintained really anywhere that enabled you to sort of drive a conversation of a piece of the pie on the right with one of the pillars on the left. They were conceived completely separately, um, and that was reality. And
Mhm.
I've seen that again and again and again and again. Um, and in actual fact, we produced that pie graph after we spent the better part of a week locked in a room trying to map the 180 odd epics that were in the pie graph on the right back to the pillars that they should have been supporting and get some kind of view of the investment allocations. Um, so you're trying to get from really an almost bottom up reversed engineered, we're doing this and we can explain how it supports our strategy like that, into a world of going, I want to come top down and frame allocations to investment pillars um, before I ever talk about the ideas that I'm going to fund. And the metaphor I always use for that is, imagine you're a professional investor. Um, if you're a professional investor, you would have a portfolio strategy. And the first part of the portfolio strategy would be, what are my allocations of my total investment portfolio to different types of investment? And then you'd have a second layer of that to say, well, if I opened up the slice that was something like US stocks, I would be thinking about, what's my spread of allocation across different sectors? Is it micro cap versus blue chip, Fortune 50? What's the mix of risk tolerance that I'm having inside my stock allocations? And you would do all of that
So,
before you ever picked a stock.
so you missed, interestingly, in that metaphor, and I love the metaphor because it's incredibly relevant here. But you missed step one of that, and it's top of mind because I have a meeting later today with my investment advisor. But her first question is always, "What are your needs?" before she gets into what that top level mix is. And I realized that when we talk about the metaphor, we don't ask that "What are your needs?" question. How much cash do you
That's
need to
beautiful.
draw? Do you need to pull from this portfolio? And so on. And that then informs that top level allocation. And I think that's the piece when you go back to corporate strategy that's missing is we have these four strategic pillars, and then we have this aisle of credit card debt in our technology.
Yep.
And we actually don't ask the question first, well, how much debt servicing do we need? How much are we going to be able to put against our uh, forward thinking value? How much are we actually investing in the future versus today, like cash flow
Yep.
equivalent? And like those top level categories don't get agreed upon
Yep.
before you even get to the risk weighting and the types of stocks and the stuff.
That is a beautiful ad. Thank you, sir. So if you pick, for me, they're kind of the anchor topics in Frame Your Strategy, of establishing the metaphor as you're thinking about, what does it mean to run a lean portfolio management with deliberate strategy. Um, but back into the kind of boot camp world, if you can't frame your strategy, at least visualize it and anchor your approach in it, right? The power of building this picture of the pie graph, doing the mapping back to your strategic pillars and beginning those conversations, and then actually anchoring almost every strategic conversation you have in that relational view, is super huge and very useful when it comes to creating change. Because for me, it's always going, whenever I kick off an LPM, I got to go, where am I in the fin year? Right? The way that I frame my
Mm,
portfolio, right, The next chance I have for big change in the way the portfolio frames is the end of Q1, right? There are things I can do today with the portfolio I have today, and there are things that I can
You know,
prepare to do the next time Q1 comes along.
that is a big insight, Mark. And like to have that explicit conversation, first validate that orange is their reality.
Yeah,
Because like I can't think of the number of executives I've talked to that we look at a big picture and say, okay, come beginning of next fiscal year is when we're going to introduce these new tools. And it's like, no, actually, April is the time to introduce those new tools for the following fiscal year,
yeah,
because that's when you actually have to start the process. But
yeah,
mapping that orange current reality value, current reality budgeting value stream, for lack of a better term, and then how does that overlay with your calendar and where are you?
yeah,
That's the bounding of potential.
absolutely.
Like that tells you what nudges you can do now and which things you have to plan ahead for. Love it.
Yeah. So my intent, by the by, is actually this becomes a activity is to draw the green and the orange in your own world,
Hmm.
uh, and then whack this slide up in the debrief and go, well, let's have a talk about what you saw, what we commonly see, and then take a trigger point out of that into the implications to our progression to lean portfolio management. Uh,
Does that exercise replace the somewhat anemic version of map your portfolio Kanban and then modify it that's in some of the stuff now?
God,
Like, is
yes.
that actually LPM rather than thinking about your epic flow?
Yeah, yeah. No, I. This is my and kind of the point that I make, right, is there's a life cycle to both your book of work and to the initiatives in the book. So if you think about your annual cycle, that's the life cycle of the book of work. Like every year you get a refresh
Mhm.
in the way it's framed. Um, and you get a chance to go in and talk to finance and talk to risk assurance and talk to your auditors and go, what are the things I want to try and shift in the management of the book of work this year? Um, and you've got to recognize that you've got these two life cycles both spinning. And depending on where you are in the project to project to product journey, you're also living in this world that says actually these two life cycles they almost beat against each other because you've often got weirdness between multi-year initiatives and your annual book of work life cycle. um, and they're long held true and painful in the legacy world. Um, so it's really worth separating those concerns and going, there's many places that I can apply levers. Um, but I got to understand the reality checks and the rhythms. And you could almost argue if you went truly geeky product with it, we're here talking about the market rhythms um, of a investment portfolio.
Yeah, not
Okay,
wrong.
so if that's frame your strategy, the next thing I'm getting to is shape your book of work. If you think of your book of work, and if I stick in nice, easy, safe speak, I'm going to talk about epics. If I think about truth, it's not necessarily that I'm talking about epics capabilities and features, because my experience has been pretty strongly that there will be some kind of existing legacy hierarchy that is managed by your enterprise PMO. And there will be a crossover point from the legacy hierarchy managed in PPM to the agile hierarchy. If you picture Epic as the top of the agile hierarchy, there's often one or two layers above that in the PPM hierarchy. And there's also, in a starting state, not necessarily a smooth translation between the two.
I think you're getting at what I talked about is my progression of ethics, which is over the life cycle of a company's growth, it inevitably starts out as epic as project, and
Yeah,
epic becomes a synonym for what you used to call a project.
yeah,
And then it becomes a synonym for a container, so epic as container, and then eventually you can get to epic as experiment.
yeah. I'm probably also going a bit beyond that. Um, let's play a worked example. Um, so this was a portfolio in a company that wasn't using Safe. They were using a Spotify Safe mashup. Um, and we had some cutover points, right? So if you live in a tooling world, their tooling world was PPM and Jira.
Hmm.
They were, of course, living in the world of taking the labels that Jira gave them. Um, so if I did a kind of safe mapping on the side, let's go safe. There was a world that said this was an epic. This was a capability. And, oops, this was a feature. The structure was complicated subsystem topology. So if I was to color code, I don't know, that's the closest to red we've got. Then we were probably sitting mostly in this kind of land. This arguably was a strategic theme. And let's call this a super epic because,
Enterprise epic.
yeah, let's call it that's what gated.
Wow.
Okay. So that's what I was getting at. um, whatever your book of work is, particularly if you have done a less strategic adoption, or in their case, they got sold a tribe adoption without a lean portfolio component to it. So they had changed their tribes, built complicated subsystem tribes, and not tried to change the way that portfolio management worked. So we were trying to build a picture to help them through that transition. The thing that I get is I don't care really what you call your book of work. I want to see your book of work all the way up to the level that your CEO views it or your enterprise investment people view it. And if that means you got multiple levels above epics, you got multiple levels above epics. I just want truth. In this particular case, what was funded in their book of work was these things. And the people who actually managed the portfolio funding didn't care about these, didn't cost them. They were, in every other sense of the word, probably very similar to a safe epic, except that they were agile stuff and money got managed up here in PPM. So if there's a world that says, I want to shape my book of work, there's a couple of things I want to do. One is to go, actually, visualize what it is. If there's a PPM version and a agile version, what are the levels? How do they interconnect? Um, but then really the other thing I'm looking for, because I know at this level I've got mixed modality of delivery. Some stuff will be agile, some will be waterfall. Some of these vehicles will be delivered partially in both ways. Some will be delivered in-source, some will be delivered outsourced. Yeah, that's the whole goal of the portfolio, is to be agnostic. Um, what I want to do is to build a notion that says we break our book of work up, decomposing by value, and whether or not we're feeding into an agile or a waterfall life cycle, I want to find smaller batches of value to feed through the system. We're trying to visualize a couple of things. One is to get to a viewpoint that says, have we got apples and oranges? Can we avoid a situation where on the same level, I have an initiative that's $150 million next to an initiative that's 150,000? Because that's not very useful to me
Hmm.
in any man's world. And this is kind of batch size leveling at a given level. The other thing I want to do is to go, what's my lowest level of value? If my lowest level of value is features sitting in arts, that's fantastic, because it means I've got stream aligned arts, or I've got quite a bit of my value flowing at the feature level inside stream aligned arts. But if, as is very commonly the case, the lowest level value actually spans arts, what is that thing? Um,
Yep.
and how do I, in composing my book of work, actually compose it in a way that enables me to sort of understand the moving pieces at the lowest level of value at some kind of realistic chunking? What I'm trying to prime myself up for with that is, when I'm trading budget, what I want to do is to trade chunks of value in and out instead of trading burn rate. If I had something and I said it's going to be 10 million bucks and somebody said, I'm only going to give you 5, in most portfolio management structures in the legacy world, they won't give you half the value, they'll spend half the money. And if you're lucky, under the hood, the bits of that that are done agile will actually be valuable. But even in that case, quite often what you'll have is a bunch of enablers that haven't necessarily been stitched together into something valuable, um, because all they're
Are
working out is
you
how many
are
people
you,
they can fund for how long.
are you talking about midstream reduction or planning time reduction?
I'm talking when I horse trade my budget, right? When I'm back over
So
here,
planning time.
yeah,
So
planning time.
not so just to be clear, not when,
Nah,
yeah,
I'm
not when the work is half done and you cut the funding and you realize you've got nothing.
nah, I'm here in Q3, Q4, right?
Hmm.
Because Q3, Q4 is, somebody said I need 20 million bucks for this, and the CIO went, that's really valuable, and I really want to support you in doing that. But the way the numbers are playing out, I can't give you 20, I can give you 10. That person who wants to do the really valuable, important thing, who got 10 instead of 20, how do you make sure that what they're doing is going, well, you know, in a lot of legacies, they go, well, I can only hire half the people, or I can only finish requirements and design, whatever the case might be. I want them instead to go, well, that 20 million was made up of these 20 valuable chunks. And if you can only give me 10, I'll pick these 10 chunks, right? So I'm trading in and out chunks of value as opposed to trading in and out the spending of money.
So if I'm gonna spin this backwards, our goal is prioritizing our epics and only pushing through the one we think we can actually do than trying to juggle the R shape to meet the theoretically desired project list.
Yep. And maybe I'm trading epics in and out. Maybe I'm trading in and out pieces of epics. I'm trying to set up for we're trading value in and out,
Value streams.
right? There's an
Yeah.
argument that says if I look to a super mature place, the allocations I make back in strategy land are actually value stream funding allocations. The epics are pieces of work competing for the funded capacity in those funded value streams. And in a flexible world, what I'm doing here is going, given the allocations I've got, these are the epics I think I'm going to do. But if I find a better epic, I'm going to pull out one epic and I'm going to trade in another epic that better maximizes the outcome that I was pursuing with that allocation. Right. So it's setting me up for what I'm trying to get to as my first real big evolutionary target is the annual cycle is capacity allocation that funds my value streams and products. There's an indicative what are the pieces of work that go in that in my book of work, but I can get flexibility in the book of work during the year within the allocations that I've established with my annual cycle.
Yep. And there's I don't know, it's called a variation of color of money sitting in there, where it's what you swap in has a reasonable overlap with where the capacity exists within the system, which might be moving forward to aligning plans and demand leveling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now how is what you've described different than the aspirational benefits of participatory budgeting?
Um, I I think participatory budgeting is chasing a similar thing. If you look at participatory budgeting and
That might be
say,
enough. It's similar outcomes, stuff like that.
look, I think it's similar, but it's a less radical shift, right? If you look at
Yeah, I think
what
that makes sense to me.
participatory budgeting is saying, set up some allocations, run a conjoint analysis process to seek input from the people on the choices that we should be making within the allocations, right? That's what it is as a science.
Mhm.
You can do all of this before you're ready to assemble large groups of people for the conjoint analysis exercise, which is PB. Um,
Yep.
a-
So the end goal is aligned, which is establish value stream budgets and establish a prioritized list of epics that actually fits.
yeah,
Or depending on whose view is only slightly oversubscribed, knowing you'll try to kill 20% of them.
yeah. Um, and frame the bits of work so you can trade them in and out later. Because you your finance people are really happy with setting themselves up for that flex. Um,
Hmm.
because the notion that that annual cycle is fixed is a complete fallacy. Right? That they know there'll be multiple adjustments made during the year every year
Yeah.
because important things will get into trouble and they'll need top ups and they will look for things and go, we want some money back. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in life.
Yeah. Well, I wanna highlight actually there's a big point in what you just said that's worth highlighting. And it's a story I had at a Fortune 50 company, and I was sitting down with a guy who was from finance and owned their overall project approval request process.
Yep.
And about mid conversation, he just unloaded because he was so upset that everybody blamed his process for why things were so hard to get funded. He's like, my process has 4 steps, and 86 steps got added by the SVPs for their own sense of control in the technology portfolio. on the finance side, we really only need these four basic things, and we can strip it down to this. So let's look at that next chunk. And I'm like, that's thank you, sir. Was kind of the attitude because it gave them infinite permission to go back to the leadership and technology and say, this is your own problem. Let's fix it and
Uh,
stop blaming finance.
couldn't agree more. There is nobody who will more willingly share frustration with the current process than the finance people, is my experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the finance is the best place to drive all this change, but that's its own conversation. So if I loop back out to the shape your book of work, it's back to that metaphor of what can I do next year versus what can I do this year. This year, I've inherited a book of work. I've got what I've got. I can play with the decomposition inside it, but I can't easily play with the book itself. Next year, I can play with the book, the way the book gets shaped. So I'm always looking at this metaphor of what can I do today and what can I start to be preparing to do tomorrow, and what can I learn from what I do today to set me up for what I want to do tomorrow in terms of the two life cycles. So the exercise that goes with this is visualize your book of work, visualize the levels. Like, so you've got some comparisons in terms of the batch sizes. Know that generally, whatever book of work you're visualizing, your core vehicle is going to be whatever gets gated, unless you've got a long way down the capacity funding or product or value stream funding path. And you're probably going to have to visualize two levels because it's actually down a level. Whatever your lowest level of value is probably going to be the really interesting thing later on. Leveling, batching, chasing lowest level of value, framing it for trading it, and having some level of understanding on, yeah, probably need to talk about capacity needs. Sorry, notes for self. Okay, so we finished identify value, which is really build a picture of today's world using some slightly different lenses in the way you assemble it, and start to think about when your next annual cycle begins and what you might like to change in the core elements of that picture when your next annual cycle comes along.
Mm-hmm.
Step 2, map the value stream, visualize. And really for me here, it's these kind of two pieces of visualize the gated level and visualize the lowest level of value. Whatever that lowest level of value is, that's going to be where you get flow and where you want your energy. Whatever the gated level is almost guaranteed not to flow. And that's foundationally the puzzle of the map, the value stream, visualize the life cycle to me is there's no point visualizing and trying to manage a Kanban system that is not flowing. If you're trying to optimize value flow, and that's a serious part of what you're trying to achieve as a portfolio, regardless of the vehicles involved, you've got to figure out what your lowest level of value is. What are the batches of value that are flowing through the system and how you're optimizing and visualizing that?
I think I disagree. I 50% disagree.
Tell me more.
Um, I think well, so if I take the gated level and look at it from a theory constraints point of view,
Yep.
you are artificially introducing a flow control point using a gate.
Yep.
And that gate might be funded control for governance reasons. It might be deployment control for security or um, sanity for your users reasons, what have you.
Yep.
But when you introduce a gate, you are introducing an artificial constraint that controls flow.
Yep.
Managing the flow in front of that is still quite valuable. So having a demand funnel, having your 80% of ideas move forward, 20% of ideas move forward, okay, only selected gated ideas move forward type of funnel in front of your gate point is quite valuable. And the front end of the portfolio Kanban actually does that quite well. What I'll argue with is everything after that point is meaningless from a flow point of view, and you might as well just have a big bucket of implementing or we don't care anymore as your two states after the gate.
Okay, then we need to talk about a number more things, and I need to figure out where to have the. So let's talk about the gated level. So,
By the way, I'll add another comment to talk about the gated level because it might be relevant to how we're about to address this. Is one of my working rules is you can't have two gated levels that are adjacent in the hierarchy, or you will guarantee zero flow. But if you have a gated level above an ungated level, you might actually see real flow at the level.
all right. So if you, and what you're telling me is I need the as is to be story. Aha. Okay, here's the game. If you look at the, let's say the Epic Kanban, the Epic is arguably a lean gate as opposed to a pre-lean gate, right? Because the gate on the Epic is actually an approval to draw down on funded capacity as opposed to a traditional gate, right? Because you've made
In the
a,
theoretical view of gate,
but if you took how's the whole safe funding fiscal governance thing meant to work, your argument is
yeah,
to say, I fund a pillar, a strategic theme, a guardrail, right? And I fund it on the basis of OKRs and KPIs that funding is meant to achieve, right?
yeah,
And an epic is a proposal to draw down on a significant component of that pre-established funding.
yep, yep. And I can map that back to controls theory if that's interesting.
Okay, so if you run that world, then the second aspect of that is that the epic gating is a repeat gate. Because what you're doing when you go up with an epic is you're saying, I've got this idea. I I haven't got detailed requirements. I haven't got detailed design. I've got preliminary estimates. If I take this idea all the way, it's going to cost me $5 million. But I've figured out how I can build an MVP of it to test the hypothesis for $500,000. So I want to go through the gate knowing the chance that I might eventually spend five, but actually I only want authorization to spend the first half because I'm going to come back and give you an opportunity to walk away at the pivot or persevere decision. If you choose to persevere,
Yep.
I'm going to ask you for the next chunk, right? And if you are moving your gating, imagining that you're evolving your gating world to suit that, what you often find is that you get some gate, and typically it's going to be a gate 3 or a gate 4, which is the drawdown funds gate, that says, I'm going to go through this multiple times. I've been like again and again and again through, we had 5 gates. And what we're going to do is we're going to go gate 1, gate 2, gate 3, gate 4, gate 4, gate 4, gate 4, gate 5. And the repeat entries to gate 4 are going to be the repeated pivot or persevere decisions on the epic.
Yep.
Um,
Yes. And save artificially limits that to 2 passes with the that you have to do a major through, otherwise it's the MVP and then full steam are the only 2 passes. Uh,
yep,
similar.
yep. And that winds up in a tension between the fact that sometimes, for example, you need to go and negotiate vendor contracts or established workforce that wants to take you deeper than that. And this is going to be about the match between the idea and the epic and the funded capacity and the nature of the funded capacity. But at that point, we're getting horrendously sophisticated for a boot camp.
Yes, I think you're right.
So if you take that view, and I'm completely with you, that says sort of it's the early stages of the frame of the epic that are interesting. In terms of flow, but I don't know that the epic, like when you overlay your annual cycle on it, you get some very interesting long delays. And although the data is interesting, and I'll always be interested in that data, it will be far less frequently interesting than when I'm monitoring the flow at the lowest level of value. So maybe the question is, it's a different level of intensity. I just see so many epic Kanbans that for all but 2 or 3 states don't move for months at a time.
Right, and I would honestly expect that at that tier for most things.
Yeah. All right.
Because honestly, to say otherwise, to say your strategy will be shifting too fast.
Yeah.
Like the epic is a reflection of your in-flight strategy.
Yeah. All right. So if you go with you're interested at the greatest level and the lowest level of value with different levels of intensity of focus, different types of insights coming out. I think the other nuance to the lowest level of value is centrally versus decentralized. Right? If you've got streamlined arts, for example, then what you're doing at the portfolio level is assisting those streamlined arts to measure and optimize the flow of value, and you're probably putting some standard lead time, cycle time agreements in place in terms of trigger points for measures. If you have a lot of work where the lowest level of value is at the portfolio, then you're looking at centralized flow management of those vehicles.
So if I want to do a recast of language to see if I'm on the same page with you,
Yep.
and if I was looking at this, I'm gonna anchor the conversation at the feature and art level for this for a moment.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing you saying is looking at that feature, and maybe if you're lucky story, but let's assume it's feature for most companies. If your features are a low level of interdependence, so measuring dependency density in thing using a metric that's something like first order percentage of features that are dependent on their other trains,
Yep.
and second order for this interdependent feature, what's the intensity? How many other trains are they dependent on as a histogram? So I kind of look at it two axis, um, prevalence and intensity.
Yep.
So for portfolios with a high degree of prevalence, and especially those with a high degree of intensity across their portfolio, you must centralize the coordination or you're going to stall.
Yep.
For the portfolios where you have a lower degree of prevalence of interdependency or a relatively straightforward low level of intensity, like managing a bunch of features with one other art is actually not that hard. They can do that bilaterally,
Yep.
but coordinating with 6 arts is quite hard. Um, that's really what you're getting at as the trigger point here, right? Because how interdependent do the arts have to be in order to release?
Yeah. In order to do something valuable, right? And I'm very specifically using the lowest level of value here as my terminology because I see so many features that aren't valuable. But if you stick in safe speak, it is the feature that you're playing with. That metaphor of centrally versus decentralized, we are exactly on the same page. So I've added the post-it notes to
Yep.
reflect that. Um,
Yep.
you know,
I mean,
it's
what's a way to?
sorry, go.
No, I think so. I'm thinking about a perpetual debate I have with product manager types in enterprise arts that are heavily interdependent.
Yep.
And I, and I want a definition of valuable that doesn't go back to lean waste and doesn't go back to judgment of the people type emotional loading. And as we were talking, I'm going to test a language here with you and see if you like it.
Yep.
Is a valuable feature is one that has the potential to directly move the metrics in OKRs,
Yes.
as opposed to being user visible or any because all the other containers and language we use is subject to interpretation and often comes across as derogatory towards suppliers.
Yep.
We were doing quite valuable work that's necessary in order to get there. So the hit feature, the value add feature, in the sense that your lowest level of value is the one that the lowest level that can directly move metrics
Yep.
without waiting on other work. Okay, I like that. And that gets one that starts to get into meaningful. All the trains can act on it.
And this is where I think there's the nuance. If you think about something like a platform art, is
Mhm.
a platform art that spits a feature out only generates value when the feature's consumed, right?
Um,
If nobody's leveraging the feature that they've spat out, then you haven't produced
for
any
some
value.
percentage of the work, yeah, yeah. Because I'll set aside operational improvement, cost reduction, things like that, which are value add features
Yeah,
directly in that.
absolutely, right?
But, yep. But if you're aiming towards a market facing feature and the platform part art does its part, it's not a value add feature until the other art does its part as well.
Yeah. All right. So if we're aligned on that kind of centralized, decentralized, and I use kind of a really simplistic terminology that says I love arts that are self-sufficient, but if you can be 80% self-sufficient chasing value, you're probably in pretty good shape. If you're much less than 80% self-sufficient, you're in for a world of pain. That's my general rule of thumb in terms of arts and value production. It's not to say that you can't maintain decentralized with a higher percentage of off-chain dependencies than that. But what tends to happen is you tend to wind up with people whose job is managing dependencies. And often there are system level optimizations available in terms of those dependencies.
Yeah, and that's maybe as a rule of thumb, that's a healthy end state. I just keep looking at it as can you be 20% better than you are now with every org shift you do?
Yep.
Because even that, like the capacity freed up by every 20% shift is dramatic and visible in both the budget and in the flow rates.
The thing I want to kind of place in your head there is the global optimization part of the puzzle.
Hmm.
Because what you often find is that many of the members of the same portfolio share the same external dependencies, right? So you tend to wind up bottlenecking around shared services or
Yep.
bottlenecking around complicated subsystem vehicles. And
Yep. And that's where these solutions move into the technical domain of internal or self-service platforms and things like that.
well, you can start to generate data that proves the value of investing in, shifting from complicated subsystem platform or,
Yep.
the various other vehicles. And so the argument to me is that they're part of the value proposition of portfolio through that lens is being able to get those system level views um, and actually see the bottlenecks emerging
Mhm.
around the external dependencies which you're not necessarily going to get if you leave them in the hands of the trains.
All right.
And
So uh, we'll make between gated level and lowest level is, how did I say? I said this in my head and didn't open up a little bit ago. The gated level needs to be the managing of purpose, not the managing of work. The lower level can be the management flow of work. And purpose, intent, pick your favorite word there.
I like that. Certainly as
And
an
that's
as an
where I,
aspirational state for the gated level of your system, your book of work.
well, and back to your point, like a lot of like finance and the board, they're managing intent when they look at those super epics and the capital investments that the board's approving.
Yeah.
They don't actually care what features are in it. They don't care what the work is in the
Oh God,
slightest.
no.
They care that
Yeah.
you're pursuing this goal and you're willing to spend 87 million against it.
Yeah.
Done. Get these items.
Yep. All right. So let me just. So let's visualize. Coming around to create flow, and I've filled in a lot less of the puzzle here, but this is really the align your plans and steer execution part to me, right? What are the portfolio level rhythms that you introduce in terms of aligning priorities and feeding work into the system? And to be brutally honest, I plan to get Wolfgang's permission to leverage his planning conference stuff because I think it's significantly more mature than pretty much anything else I've seen in that space. But that's the how we're maintaining alignment across the portfolio um, in terms of priorities, um, competition between priorities, and our commitments to each other. Um, and then steering execution is really the monitoring, escalation, portfolio level intervention in the life cycle of the book of work.
Yep. I'm having to squint to see it because you're not zoomed in very well. But
Let me zoom in more.
yeah.
Um,
And if you're in a safe, organized portfolio that is your routine train operations and so on, if it's a different or a supplier, significant elements of your portfolio or flow improvements you can get through whatever operating model you have.
yeah,
So
and
that's not specific to running ours.
I think it's one of the interesting things to me, Eric, is some of the stuff that has been made a lot less visible in the safe portfolio stuff than it once was. Um, if you go back to a lot of the early safe content went, not everything in your portfolio is going to be agile, right? And actually, the portfolio is where you stitch together the multiple ways in which delivery might work under the banner of your strategy and your epics as your vehicles of intent. It feels like if you really kind of look through all the modern safe LPM stuff, it kind of assumes everything's going to be an art. And it's down to, you take something like the lean business case. Once upon a time, the lean business case template said, what's your delivery model going to be? Is it going to be agile? Is it going to waterfall? Is it going to be a mix? Now it says
Yeah, I forgot
it,
about that.
right? And that to me, it was always actually really valuable because as soon as we went to portfolio level, we went how we got different parts of our world in different states and some parts of our world that may never be in an agile state, right? Um, But now it only asks you in the lean business case template, are you going to in-house or are you going to buy or build? Um, so it's kind of lost that nuance. It says actually the portfolio is meant to be execution mechanism agnostic, which I think is part of the reason why I always felt it was lean portfolio management, not agile portfolio management, because it recognized that you would have different vehicles.
So, um, yes, yes, it is definitely less prominent. No argument or question there. Um, yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is, like, I guess the main point I have there is the mechanics are still there. They're just not highlighted.
Yeah, the mechanics are still there. It's
Um,
it's just
eh,
if every version of Safe fundamentally says the biggest evolution that's going to happen is the way we tell the story, right?
mhm,
Um, the competencies, notionally a massive change. Reality wise, a different way of telling the story and navigating into the pieces of the framework. Um, it- there is always new stuff in each version of Safe, but the biggest thing that's new in each version of Safe is the way you tell the story. And I think the prominence of the reality checks of different things has receded a bit. And I think that becomes very interesting given sort of one of the things that was coming out at the fellow retreat was that there was an increasing pattern of people starting with LPM rather than starting with Essential Safe.
yes.
Um, and if you run in a pattern that says I'm starting with LPM rather than starting with Essential Safe, I'm guaranteed to be managing mixed mode. All right, so coming around, so a couple of notes just added for myself while talking to you. That really there's a footnote on Visualise your life cycle that you're setting the scene for flow optimization. And then in create flow, it's align your plan, steer execution, and apply flow accelerators, right? Act on your insights. Establish pull was the one that just wrecked me for a while in terms of going, how do I make the cycle work? And I wound up going and just doing a bunch of digging on different examples of pull. The best example that I got in the end was supermarkets and the way that they pull restocks and that whole sort of demand management of it. And it didn't perfectly translate as a metaphor from the supermarket to whatever, but I went, actually, the answer here is if I think about pull at the portfolio level, I'm thinking about the job of leveling supply and demand, right? And whether that is demand smoothing or supply demand balancing, it's that notion of the fact that what I'm trying to do is establish vehicles that can pull work as it becomes available. And then the job upstream is to find the valuable things to pull. I'm going to give you kind of two
Yeah.
triggers. Sorry, go on.
No, keep sharing your thoughts. I got a bunch of formative thoughts coming on this.
This is the one I'm least comfy with as a metaphor, but it it prompts me to tell stories I want to tell.
There's
So I want
there's
to tell.
two.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, you tell stories. Do you want my thoughts or do you want to tell stories first?
Let me tell two stories, and then we'll go to
Okay.
your thoughts because they're short stories, right? Here's story number one. Just because I have money doesn't mean I can spend it. Uh, this is the world of every enterprise ever. Is somebody somewhere going, I've got an approved business case and X number of $1 million. which has absolutely nothing to do with the organization having the capacity to actually spend that X number of $1 million. Because there is usually a very large disconnect between the annual investment cycle and an understanding of the available delivery capacity in the organization of the nature required to fulfill the things that are being horse traded in the investment book. And it's a big problem. So there's kind of problem number one. um, and what we wind up with is a whole bunch of people with money looking for places to push the money. As opposed to people who can solve problems pulling interesting problems to solve. Here's the next one. Demand smoothing. If you look at the typical way spend goes, right, and it always depresses me, right? Because I talk to really good financial controllers and, you know, finance-oriented portfolio managers, and they go, the thing I love most about SAFE is that the trains spend exactly what they're meant to spend every PI, right? We land our burn rate
Mhm.
on a dime. um, because if you look at a typical project-driven organization, what you get usually is a massive underspend in Q1 because they've only just got confirmation of how much money they have to spend as the quarter starts. They have a large on-ramp time for staff and delivery capacity. So they can't spend the money they're meant to spend in Q1 because they're busy trying to get hold of the staff to spend it on.
Yep.
They get to Q2, and if they're lucky, they've got the staff, but they're also copping flack for having underspent in Q1. And they know that when people see underspending, it means that they're a right target if somebody needs money. So
Mhm.
they overspend in Q2, and then they massively overspend in Q3 because
Yep. But they
Q
and they got all that stuff.
right they've got all their staff, and Q3 is the time that important things that are in trouble start fishing for money, and the centralized folks start looking for places to ask for money to be returned to the pot from. And if you've spent it in
Mhm.
Q3, they can't take it back from you in Q4.
Right.
And then in Q4, by nature, you kind of have to underspend, A, because you've tried your hardest not to have everything available to you, and B, because you don't know how much money you're going to have next year. Therefore, you can't afford to run a full rack rate in terms of your staff profile,
Yep.
right? This is the world of project-driven organizations. Um, so if you look at that notion that says, actually, what I'm trying to do is to, in framing my strategy, use the strategic framing to fund strategic vehicles that I can then run smooth through the year. I smooth out my spend. I don't commit funds to things that I have no capacity to execute on, but I have an implication that says I then have to smooth out the way the work gets fed through the system so that I don't wind up with too much ebb and flow of peaks and valleys of the demand entering my vehicles.
Yep. So that's the that's the smoothing element.
Yep. So it boils down to create vehicles that can pull, smooth the demand into the vehicles you've created.
Yep. And what you just described is an annualized version of the old MIT beer game.
Yep.
And we're 6 years in on the wild swings by the time we look at it, since last time they reset the port and tried to start over.
Yep. This is also the world of pretty much every major enterprise in Australia.
Hmm. No, it's decidedly not uncommon.
Yep.
There's also data I remember from 10 years ago, relatively small, $100 million um, spend rate. So in their technology group, so not huge,
Yep.
and they did a year's worth of tracking with it was called Rally Insights back in the day. It was kind of measuring their flow metrics
Yep.
essentially. And they saw a chart like that, and independent of the staffing swings, because they didn't have that. They were mostly full time. They didn't have the vendor scale up, scale down habits.
Yep.
But just the distraction of annual planning was a 15, it was something like a 15% impact on productivity through the planning cycle from the lack of management availability.
Yep.
And they took that and they mapped it, and it was like on our $100 million spend, we're spending $14 million on this annual planning process in terms of productivity cost.
Yep.
Is it worth it? It's kind of the very obvious next question. That was their tip. That was their tip towards what today we'd call LPM. It was more of a continuous model.
Um, and that kind of the
So
um, backup in my later backlog was deliberately excluded complications of what happens when you say actually your lean portfolio management has to include BAU as well as investment. But that's a whole different question.
honestly, that it simplifies a lot in my experience when you include that
I
because you can overspend on BAU and tech debt and then harvest from that when you really need to, but that's dangerous. Um,
I th- there's a lot of benefits to when you get there, but you don't get there day one. Um, because that one
so
winds
going
up.
back to the demand smoothing and the
Yep.
poll, yeah, let me zoom in on the poll and let me opine for a second. So you had a bunch of it with the level supply and demand. You could get into concepts of takt time and so on. But I think the other piece of establishing poll is you might have this under step five, but in step four is actually where I think you do the productization as a leveling tool. So you active that's where you start to actively look at your ability to extract flows and create smooth flow that have pull in subsets of your portfolio, get those islands of stability, and use that productization then to establish pull in local areas that exit the portfolio process. The portfolio allocation becomes here's your annual budget. Now we'll give you a higher individual item threshold because you're operating with a consistent flow. You get a different guardrail because you've demonstrated you can spend the money wisely.
Yeah, I've got that in step five.
And that starts to drive.
I hadn't
Yeah,
written the
but to me
posts yet,
that's
but the
after
mental
we
mapping
establish
there.
pull. Because pull comes from stream alignment. The other tool that's hiding in there is the intentional capacity mapped epic backlog. So post approval,
Yeah,
after the gate.
that was that was the that was this,
Yep.
which I had up in the Shape Your Book of Work. Um,
Shape the book work, but a big piece of establishing pull is to create the right small buffer just in front of the workers that makes sure they have a consistent flow of work regardless of what's going on at the overall financial layer.
yeah, and that's the demand smoothing for me.
Hmm. The other The other piece I saw one company get a reasonable success with around that I guess pulls into that same area is they made staff and surge different colors of money. So groups
Yeah,
had a baseline spend that was guaranteed, but the surge budget was a discretionary shared budget that had to be requested,
yep. And that comes back to,
and that protected against the.
well, that's run at some playing with peak pricing models, right?
Yeah, sure, essentially.
Yeah. Um, so I utterly agree with you about the productization, um, and the moving towards vehicles that can pull. Um, it's just going to toy with whether that goes in evolution or not. Because I had it mentally mapped to evolution, that whole organized around the flow of value. But you're right, you could do it here because your evolution could actually be in your inputs. Maybe that's a let me chew on it. I love that as the kind of keystone of my other commentary in established pull. All right, that's my big takeaway one. So here's my question for you. Having traveled the circle, how does the circle stack up for you as the model?
A circle stacks up. I'll start with that. It's definitely cyclical. Um, hmm. Let's see, does it stack up? I question PDCA might be a better model. Scan, plan, do, check, act, with the scanning being the annual injection point. Go back to the Hoshin as a loop, as a concept.
Let
But
me,
I think the mapping to the overall organized flow and other things, I think it might be good enough, like as a starting point.
let me try one more with you, inspired by your A circle concept. Um, okay, no, no, I don't want to smart up. Let's try. I just want to play the game. Um, Game looks like this. Circle one. And this is going to need arrows and directionality, but bear with me. Let's go one more different color. Okay. Um, so you know how safe uses the double loop of the train, right? And you kind of have the here's the wheel that the team goes through where they do iteration planning and blah 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 blah. And then on the outer
Hmm.
wheel, you've got this wheel spins more slowly because it's the PI cycle. Um, what happens if if your loop looks a little bit more like this. So I'm playing with this concept that says we've got our annual cycle, it spins every year. And we've always got to know where we are in the year. And we've got to recognize it's the changes we can make this year and the changes we can prepare for next year. Then we've got the cycle of the gated work. And then we've got the cycle of the lowest level of value. And the circle in the middle spins fastest. The green circle spins more slowly. And the blue circle spins once a year.
I mean, you're at that point, you're back to the classic rings model.
You are.
Rallies had their rings, CA had their rings, version 1 had their rings. Safe, I think, has pictured the rings in a couple different places.
Yeah.
As and I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I mean, there's a reason we latched on to a daily cycle, a fortnightly cycle, a quarterly cycle, and an annual cycle. Because it fits with the traditional business flow.
I don't think it tells the story of the LPM thinking, though. I think there's a visual that helps with that. That's useful for.
Yeah, because to your point though, if you were to overlay the two and show that there's different loops happening at different levels,
Yeah.
that's where it starts to get interesting. We're just
I,
looking at an old strategy deployment picture that's quite similar.
I think this has value when drawn slightly less drunkenly. I think this has value as a reference model to kind of carry a metaphor that you go back to again and again and again. Yeah. But in terms of the storytelling, I think the storytelling basically follows my steps better. So let me go back to the A circle question. Right. Here's the things that feel a bit orcs for me about the 5 Womack steps. If I think about seek perfection, I actually want to seek perfection in every one of these things. Because I want a story that suits where you're starting and where you're trying to go. And I mean, I can come at the end of, a step 5 and go ensure evolution, and I can go, these are the kinds of potential moves you'll take in each of the other steps, or I could go in each of the other steps, this is an evolution, and different steps will evolve at different paces, but if you unlock this here, that'll unlock that there.
Mm-hmm.
So I could drop step 5 pretty easily because I could just embed that in everything else. I'd also, to be honest, drop establish pull pretty well, because I think a lot of the, productization question actually becomes an evolutionary path of framing your strategy. Um, because the more effectively you frame your strategy in a kind of lean way, the more that you then use your strategy to fund your lean vehicles, and you frame your strategy around products and value streams, right? And if you think about balancing supply and demand, Well, that kind of takes care of the balance of supply and demand because the strategy establishes the supply and then the book of work is demand, and you shape your book of work against the established supply. Um, and then you think about the pull aspect of it. Well, the pull aspect of it really turns up that the other bits of pull turn up when you're getting into flow. At which point you're getting back to a model which becomes frame your strategy, shape your book of work, visualize your life cycle, and optimize flow.
So at this point, I think I'm back into thinking of it as double loop learning, because what you've got as a circle there is your improvement kata for the portfolio.
Yep.
The operation of the portfolio and the flow of work itself is an inner loop that has to operate continuously, and then this loop works against that. So right now you kind of munge together the strategy deployment flow and the improvement flow. The strategy deployment flow, you're right. It could be identify value, identify what shifts that drives to your shape, and operate it. But the perfection game or the improvement kata around it is what's the next new large chunk of value and improvement we want to pursue, and now what shape next best serves us to get there. And this is like one of my um, transformation realities of statements is every transformation is a series of steps, not a single leap. Like you don't change from A to B in an agile transformation. You make your first step and then you make your second step, and you've got a vision of what 7 steps out might be, but
Yeah.
you're doing it incrementally. And this is your loop to do the incremental steps on a portfolio level. So the value might be what new strategic capabilities does our strategy deployment process need to exhibit, our portfolio process. Now, how do we need to reshape our flow and our processes and our approach to make that slightly better, relevant to the book of work that's currently in play? Because it's a big, slow moving book of work. And how do we make it flow better? Now, how do we connect it better with its demand source, which is your business owners and your market, depending on how productized you've gone? Now, let's reflect, learn, and identify what the goals are going to be for the next cycle and keep doing that over time. And maybe it's only annual. Maybe you only get to do this once a year. Maybe to your point, with where are you in your cycle, you get to do smaller nudges continuously, but a big loop every year. It's more like Kaizen throughout and the Kaikaku annualized.
um, Let me test another thought for you on the inner outer loop. Because I don't, it's kind of not Kaikaku versus Kaizen. Um, it's almost like, let me test this next year, this year. Right. And, and next year's a slower loop. And there's a moment, right? There's a moment where you transition. Because I think what you think about is the Kaikaku, and I'm completely getting where you're coming from with it, right? The Kaikaku is the, January 1 or July 1 or October 1, depending on your fin year, right? The date of transition into the next version of the model that was possible because of the annual cycle. Um, but there's another truth that says if you look at that, right, that outer loop, which is the annual cycle, it runs all year, right? You're applying Kaizen all the way through whatever this is, right? As it evolves. But then you get to this point and it switches into now execute on it. Um, and so you're executing on the thing you've created here while you loop back into, after a short breather, creating the next thing.
But I think there's a missing piece of what there are a significant number of flow improvements and minor governance changes you can do mid-year.
Yeah, that'd be
But you
the
can't
the that'd be the improvements, the Kaizen in the inner loop.
yeah, the outer loop is the one that changes the way I think of it is the stuff that changes your financial strategy and therefore goes to the board or impacts how you report to the street.
Yep.
Like that's the stuff you don't want to tweak mid-year because I don't know, you don't change your capitalization approach mid-year in a way that changes your earnings.
Yep.
Like that's just that's in the bad idea category for consultants and leaders alike.
Yep.
Um, but I think it's an important one to clarify the difference between the operations of the portfolio and the changing of the portfolio in your model.
Yeah.
Because I could also read this as steps one, two, three, and four are all about how to operate the portfolio and set it up each year or each loop through. And step five is where you identify and do the continuous improvement learning.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. That one, I like the next year, this year. We're saying the same thing in different words. I'm very convinced.
Okay.
um,
The one other question I would have is, did you for the steps three and four, did you mine the portfolio flow article for ideas?
um, I haven't got inside the detail of that one yet. Um, I don't know that when I read the portfolio flow article, I read anything new. Um, I know that when I get stuck into the pieces of that puzzle, I'll reread it. Um, but I don't remember seeing anything I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, it's nothing specifically new, but the way they mapped it to the principles or the flow principles actually is helpful perhaps for mapping it to your loop.
Yeah. So if you think
And then
about,
and it
sorry, go on.
well, and it minimize it starts to address some of the things we've been talking about, like minimize handoffs and dependencies, starts to talk about understand when cross-stream coordination is required.
Yeah.
So it starts to put a surface area you can point back to if you want to.
All right. Uh, I will make sure I double check that. So if you're very reductionist with where we've got to here, what we've fundamentally done is we've gone, we want two legs, not three. um, and we've separated them differently, right? Um, but at the end of the day, that's kind of where we've landed. We've said, you know, frame next year's portfolio and operate this year's portfolio.
Yeah.
And you know there's Kaizen in both. But there's a big moment that happens as that thing transitions to here and you breathe before you head back out to there.
Yep. And the type of Kaizen available in operation is smaller than the framing piece, but the framing piece includes both strategy and operational approach. And that's
Oh,
actually, I think enough has. d- Does the portfolio picture anywhere still have the triangles with the arrows between them? in safe?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yes, it does.
Oh, there it is. And the story of like your investment strategy influences how you operate, and your operations approach influences how you govern, but your governance should not constrain how your strategy works.
Yeah,
Like that story is still particularly relevant here.
yeah.
Did you ever encounter Carl Scotland's hourglass diagram?
I'm not sure that I did.
So it's he draws a picture an hourglass with two streams. One at the top is your product stream, which is you're converting ideas to impact, or you're converting money to better product, or whatever, however you want to frame that. You're investing money to get a better product flow. And
Yeah,
below it, he draws another horizontal right, left to right arrow that is you have a team and you're investing to create a better team with more capability. And then he below the top one, he has a loop that says you're doing the work of building the product, and above the second one, you have a loop that intersects in the middle that says you're doing the work of building a better team, and you should measure and account for both outcomes.
ah,
And
nice.
you're getting a little bit into that here, where if you replace team and people with the portfolio's non-workflow stuff, like not the content in the portfolio, but the shape and behavior of the portfolio itself,
Yeah,
you're kind of developing that double loop hourglass shape here, where it's like you want to optimize the flow of strategic value coming through in terms of themes and epics, and you also want to optimize the improvement of the portfolio's capability to operate.
uh,
He also has a heck of a lot of content on strategy deployment, it turns out.
I know Carl went crazy on strategy deployment. Um, Let me leave you with this one, and then I think I'm going to try and turn my brain off. So, if we know that we've got this loop, which is framing next year's portfolio, and then we're operating this year's portfolio, then there's a truth that says the way we frames next year's portfolio both opens opportunities and provides constraints for the way we operate as we pass between the two horizons. And then as we operate, that generates data, which is going to inform the framing of next year's portfolio. Let me see, because I should be
Just
getting
gets into
proof points out of this that feed back into that.
Yep. So portfolio context becomes the thing on the left in safe terms, and you've got a little bit of things you could add to it around flow metrics, perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know that I say more about the postie on the right.
So whatever we do in framing this, right, is going to hopefully be an evolution, right? We made these new breakthroughs in our funding model, our gauging model, um, our investment review process, our funding release process, whatever the case might be, right? So we opened some new doors. Um, and at the same time, there's some doors we didn't manage to open, which means that when you're operating and you're Kaizening, there are some constraints that you're not going to be able to move beyond because we didn't manage to crack that nut.
Okay, so it's not a look ahead that influences how you manage this year's portfolio. It is a transition to you're changing the landscape within which next year's portfolio will operate when it becomes the current year's portfolio.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Because there's also an element how by and I've seen this work is by sharing forward what's going to happen next year, it allows people to improve how they do the end of year of the current year. So there's actually that plan feeds forward and becomes the reality and allows people to make better end of year staffing decisions and um, not quite a pre-commit on Q1, but kind of like a expectation setting, like go ahead and hit the ground running. You can trust you'll have at least this much. You don't have to
Um,
wait for it.
I believe that as an example comes out of whatever the evolution you do in your model, right?
Perhaps maybe that takes a year to get there.
Yeah. um, the more solidly you get into product based or value stream based strategy, the more that the fin-year boundary disappears in its impact on your operations, right? Because at the end of the day, what are you going to do on the fin-year boundary? Well, you're potentially going to adjust some of your funded capacity, and if it's all arts, there might be a little bit of shifting of the landscape in terms of likely arts, but your book of work is going to be in continuous flow.
Mhm. And that's probably the biggest one is to make those multi-year programs feel less weird and special.
Yeah, because all you've got is you've got stuff in your book of work, um, which is in fluid motion because of the work you've done on your funding and gating strategy to enable it to be in fluid motion, because everything that's in your book of work is just stuff that's competing for your funded capacity, right? So Q4 to Q1 becomes, in by and large, really similar to Q1 to Q2, because the truth is, you know, all you're potentially doing is adjusting your capacity allocations. And you're knowing the likelihood of that quite a long way beforehand.
Yep.
All right. I like that.
I pasted a link. I DM'd you a link to Carl's blog from. You ready for this? 2010.
Of course.
And I know I talked with him about it earlier than that because I remember drawing it on Kanban workshop walls before it was posted.
Oh dear. That's not the link I wanted, I don't think. Actually, let me double check. No, that's not the link.
Um,
There we go. That's the link.
yeah, so I think we're wrapped. Good. It seems like a good place to end. Do we want to demonstrate our own dog food and do a brief retrospective on whether this met your goals and time invested, and then call it a day for me and a night for you?
Um, Absolutely. Did it make my goals? Hugely valuable. Thank you. Um, just that ability to roam through and test your thinking, um, and get to. I knew it just didn't quite feel right, and I couldn't think my way through it. But I love that landing point. 'Cause at the end of the day, nothing really changes about the stuff that's going in it. What changes is the way that you organize and communicate it. Um, and if there's one thing the whole pink sheet process has been teaching me, it's the power of thinking your way through the models. So I love that end model we've landed at. That's useful as anything. So many thanks. Sorry that it was still so formative in terms of pen on paper, but that
Well,
is the
if you
life
had it
of your
looking all
brain.
professional and designed if it was all like professionally designed in a PowerPoint presentation, I'd be hesitant to argue with it. Remember, isn't that a UX truth?
Ah, God, that is
The higher
such
the
a UX
fidelity,
truth.
the less relevant the feedback.
Yeah, and the less likely the iteration. Um, Inverting the retro across to you, your enjoyment in value add from the conversation.
I love the conversations and the debate. So definitely in on that and valued that. The specific learning points, given that it's a reshaping of a lot of current stuff, there's like relatively few new insights, but there were a couple big ones in there I noted. Um, one reframing some of my older statements that really helped here. And then one idea I didn't really talk about, but I had this momentary thought of recasting the roles of the portfolio into four different elements of architecture: enterprise architecture, organizational architecture, funding architecture, purpose architecture, and flow architecture. So like thinking of it as like what are the five domains you're really trying to influence downward from the portfolio
Yeah.
in the improvement cycle? And thinking about my purpose hierarchy talk and some relevant things that were in there. Um, and then yeah, just loving that we're continuing to iterate and he- do the perfection game on our streaming and how we think about it. And if you zoom in on the wheel, if you think about it, we've got like we're getting better at specifying what value we want out of it and organizing ourselves around that at the beginning of every stream, and then working to maintain a flow and focus on that. And I see that happening. So, to anybody who might be watching this, I encourage you to help us establish a poll and tell us what other kinds of things we might want to be talking about or improvements. And we're going to also debrief on the streaming and the challenges and what we can do to compensate for me being in the mountains with low signal while still having an effective stream. So,
Yeah, that's probably my biggest. Oh, it'd be nice to buy some better bandwidth. Um, but to be
I'll tell you
honest, I
what, I'm
mean,
gonna go to Mexico. I'm gonna fly to Mexico in a couple weeks and just sit on fiber if that's okay.
that'll work for me. Um,
I do find it ironic that my house in Mexico has far better internet than either of my parents or my girlfriend's parents' houses.
it is kind of fun. Um, I think my favorite moment, like I'll give you two favorite moments for the stream, and then I'll call it a night. Favorite moment was the bit where we actually figured the this year to next year transition model. But the other favorite moment was just your highlight about the sort of what are your needs, where are you in life, and life goals precursor to the investment strategy discussion.
Hmm.
Because I've used and found the investment strategy discussion so powerful so many times. Um, but that's just a great and really smack myself in the head that I haven't been doing it, tweak to it. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then I'll give you an example of where it played out just as a parting gift. Then, um, one of the companies I was supporting the portfolio design for, the they were trying to design the LPM approach without considering the company's financial strategy. And the financial strategy in flight for that company at the moment was trying to make the lift from a value stock to a growth stock and reinvigorate into a high growth mode. And if the portfolio strategy at first wasn't even considering that from how it allocated money, it made the rest everything else that flowed from it not relevant and on a flawed foundation. Um, what it ended up highlighting when we started to include it, though, is that the promise to the investors wasn't being updated.
Yeah.
So it actually did take the full year to change the process because we, at the same time that we could not, I'm very careful not to identify companies here, but so at the same time that we could not, wanted to jump to growth, which requires sacrifice, we couldn't put the dividend at risk. And it took a full year of messaging readiness to prepare the market to make that shift.
Very nice.
So that's where like goals elements that I think about.
You triggered a great laughter moment for me though, um, because there's a number of times that I've been through this where the actual strategy was nothing to do with the declared strategy. Um, as in the active strategy was massive cost out. Massive cost out was declared nowhere in the shared strategy.
Mhm.
Um, and it was disguised in the book of work. Um, which makes that kind of where are you in life, what are your life goals, and how do you relate that to your investment strategy a little bit challenging. Um,
Yep.
but I was talking to a friend and they went, it's one of the reasons that if I really want to know what's going on at a company I'm working at, I look at their annual reports, because
Oh,
what they're telling the
yeah.
investors will be the truth, and it's often much more believable than what they're telling me.
Um, I mean, I'm assuming you do this too, but whenever I even have a sales call with a new company, first thing I do is look at their last investor day deck and listen, or at least read the notes of their last analyst call.
I've learnt to in recent years. I didn't for a very long time, but there you go.
If I do work for private companies, it gets much more interesting trying to figure out how to do that.
um,
Then you're delving through the news, but
on which note, my alarm's down to 4.5 hours away, so I am going to call it a wrap, and I'll
yes,
chat
I'll
to you
talk to
soon.
you in 36 hours.
All right, ciao, ciao.
Cheers.